Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. And know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. This is a weekly video that I do for my congregation in South Burlington. And so if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, or share these videos with anyone you feel called to. Our first reading is from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. After these things, God tested Abraham. God said to Abraham, "Abraham," and Abraham said, "Here I am." God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer Isaac there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to the young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on top of the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." So today I want to talk about Genesis 22. This is the story about Abraham taking Isaac up the mountaintop because God told him to kill his son in order to prove his loyalty. This is a passage that a lot of people have a problem with. It irks our sense of morality to think that God would command any father to murder his son in order to prove that he loves God more. Even though God eventually is like, "Hey, psych, I actually don't want you to kill your son," there is a sort of sick sense of craziness that is present in this passage when a modern reader goes through it, especially as you have Abraham and Isaac silently walking up the mountain, and Abraham has this knife and fire, and his son is carrying the wood that Abraham plans on burning him alive with. Well, he wasn't going to burn him alive because he was going to stab him through the heart first. It's hard for people nowadays to get our minds past that, but I think that we need to recognize that the Bible in a lot of ways represents an evolution of our thinking about God. This passage from Genesis is probably around 3,000 years old. It could be older, and to put that into context, 3,000 years ago, written language was new technology. And I think that we need to recognize that our understanding of God changes over time. And so I also would like to share a message from Matthew chapter 10. A reading from Matthew chapter 10, verses 40 through 42. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. And so, this passage from Matthew chapter 10 does show us that the way in which people within the Hebrew and Jewish tradition thought about God changed over time. And I think that when we read the message of Genesis, the way in which people thought about sacrificing to God was very different than how Jesus was instructing people to give to God. When the Hebrew people within Genesis were talking about giving to God, they were talking about literally living into a contractual relationship. God is the boss. God tells you what to do, and you got to be willing to do that because that's more important than anything, even your firstborn son. And I think we can miss the moral message that the Hebrew authors of this passage were trying to teach to us because we can't understand the social context, the historical context, the different form of morality that is being presented to us as modern readers. This is coming from a day and an age where God was the most important thing, and it was seen as admirable that Abraham would sacrifice Isaac in order to appease God. So it's important for us to take Genesis for what it is. It is not something that necessarily speaks to us from a place that we understand today, but it is trying to communicate to us in its own language how we can serve God. And it's okay for us to look back at that message and to recognize that the way in which we serve God now is different. We can learn from this passage, the way in which I think Jesus learned from this passage in Matthew 10 when he tells us that, okay, we do need to sacrifice in order to serve God. There are some things that we need to be willing to give up of ourselves that are important in order for us to reap the rewards that God has waiting for us. Maybe those rewards are not a land in which our descendants can be fruitful and multiply. Maybe that reward looks more like thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The defeat of injustice and the creation of a world that is more just. Maybe the way in which we sacrifice to God looks less like killing your firstborn son on an altar and more like giving to the prophets who are speaking to God's love, giving to the needy who are in need of support, living loving lives that are able to recognize that maybe the relationship that we have with God is not intended to be so much contractual as it is meant to be familial. Jesus encourages us to look at our brothers and sisters in community as just that, brothers and sisters, people whom we are a part of a holy family and all responsible to. And Jesus equates giving to God, sacrificing to God, as us giving what we have in abundance to those who do not have in abundance. So the moral here that Genesis and Matthew are trying to communicate to us is that in order to serve God, we need to be willing to give up things that are important to us, things that we hold on to that maybe others could use a little bit more. I think that here in Vermont, we are dealing with a crisis of homelessness and poverty. And even though there has been an extension to the motel program here in Vermont that's been putting a roof over a lot of people's heads who are homeless, it doesn't change the fact that this is a temporary stay, and that there are still a larger number of people who lack the stability of a home here in Vermont as more and more people come in and buy up homes and property and make it so it is just that much more difficult to even own property here in our state. We are living in a time where there is a large difference between those who have an abundance and those who are struggling to get by. And I think that one of the things that we, especially in my congregation here in South Burlington, should be trying to wrap our minds around is just how different the culture of those who have an abundance is from those who do not have much at all. We can very easily overlook the needs of others because we are comfortable with what we take for granted. And very often we need to be able to sacrifice those things that we take for granted and make us comfortable and give us security in life in order for us to better understand how we can bring God's love into the world and serve God. I am not a big fan of the narrative that we get in Genesis 22. It makes me really uncomfortable when the story has Abraham walking with Isaac, and Isaac's like, "Hey Dad, where's the ram that we're going to sacrifice to God? I don't see it." And Abraham's holding that knife and he's like, "Oh, God will provide a lamb for sacrifice, son." I mean, that's creepy. And I'll be the first to admit it. But I also will admit that that's not the point that the folks who gave us this story were trying to make. They were trying to tell us that God asked Abraham to do something that made him really uncomfortable in order to better serve God. And if we can overcome the really out of context way in which that's being communicated to us in this passage, I think that we can better understand why and where it is Jesus is coming from in Matthew 10 when he tells us that, yeah, we need to sacrifice to the poor. We need to sacrifice to those who are struggling. We need to sacrifice to those who are fighting injustice within the world so that we can better support them and make it a more just world. That didn't come out of nowhere. It is an evolution of our understanding and our relationship with God. And I think that as we continue this tradition within the church and within our lives, we need to recognize where the tradition comes from. This is why these traditions are important. This is why the Bible is important. It gives us a framework in which we can build upon. But if we're not willing to build, if we're going to just be repeating the same mistakes, which I think many people do, an example being parents who feel that because they love God more than anything else, that it's okay for you to cast out your sons and daughters if they are LGBTQ+. Like, that's, I feel, is a sad inability to change with the times. And a sad misuse of what I feel the Bible is intended for. Yeah, these passages of Scripture can be hard for us to understand. And sometimes in our struggle to understand them, we may make the mistake of taking them literally, or we may make the mistakes of not paying attention to them at all. I think there's a middle ground here, and if we're willing to seek out the message of what our brothers and sisters across time are trying to communicate to us through these pieces of literature, these accounts of their relationship with God, then it really can help us to build a deeper understanding of what giving to God means in the world today.